Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paul Davies from Viridor. This session is on negative emissions, as I call it, putting the net into net zero. This afternoon session, we've got a great sort of diverse panel of looking at how we can achieve negative emissions. And at negative emissions, why important? Well, they are there to offset those sectors that find it hard or expensive to offset their carbon. So are fundamentally built into what's needed to get to net zero. The complication is this is not one sector. It includes things like energy from waste, which I'm in, bioenergy with CCS, so BECCS as it's known for short, direct air capture, DACS for short. So different technologies that would get it into geological storage. But also negative emissions includes things like natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions, it's called, things like trees and soil capture that can capture it. So it's quite a diverse sector. How to reward them when they've got different costs, different purposes, different durations, they're geological or non-geological. We will need business models to do that and to get over sort of basic transparency how it works. On the business models, we've got a voluntary market, which is companies that pay because they want to go net negative. We will hopefully move towards a regulated or compliance market, so where actually you can buy negative emissions as an offset to your carbon obligations. And we will certainly need a level of government-led sort of concession structures or contracts for differences to encourage some of these nascent industries. We've also got to work a lot about making sure everyone agrees how we measure it. Is it additional? What's the duration? So some complex things to do to develop that market. A quick advert at the beginning. A number of us on this call are a member of the Coalition for Negative Emissions, which has been established precisely to grapple and form the business models to underpin this broad sector and address some of those issues around duration and additionality and measurement. So for those of you that intimately are interested either as a consumer of a negative emissions or as a capturer, do come and join that coalition. So I can do that as an upfront advert. I'm sure I'll remind you at the end. Given all of that, we've got a diverse panel of speakers here and hopefully a logical progression of what we're going to go through. We're going to start with Joanna Campbell from the National Infrastructure Commission. They have just completed a report with Joe at the helm of that around engineered greenhouse gas removals. So really, what are the key conclusions of that report? A report that made me laugh out loud at one point when they talked about the technologies that were hard to abate, including flying and cows. I didn't realize cows was a technology. I had some image of cows with a little carbon capture and storage thing on their backside, but let's not go there. Followed from him, then we've got Baz Sudmeyer from the Boston Consulting Group, and leading there on carbon and climate, and in particular, give us a buyer's perspective on the voluntary market, the pricing signals, cost trajectories. Then over to Amy from Carbon Engineering, in particular trying to deploy DACS at scale in the UK. So giving the perspective, although she has a background at Virgin, so maybe a bit of a purchaser perspective as well there. And then finally, Carl from Drax, clearly he heads the BECCS strategy at Drax. So what do they need to enable the investment in negative emissions? So lots to get through. We'll start with Joanna in that case. And then Joanna, I think if you go to do some slide share, because you've got some slides summarizing the recent report. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Paul. Bear with me while I get these slides up. So hopefully everyone is able
looking
to
good.
see.
Looking good.
Super. I think I'm now off video as well. Oh, never mind. I don't think you can have both me and the slides. So thank you, Paul. So just by way of a brief introduction, so the National Infrastructure Commission provides government with impartial advice on major long-term infrastructure challenges. We were asked last year by government to explore the potential of emerging greenhouse gas removal technologies, or to give them their other name, negative emissions technologies. Broadly, as Paul has said, this term covers direct air capture technologies and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. They involve, in different forms, ways to capture carbon that would otherwise be in the atmosphere and then store it underground using carbon transport and storage networks. And so in July this year, we published our report, which makes recommendations to government on the technologies that should be deployed to produce negative emissions, the policies needed to incentivise their rollout, and importantly, the timeline of decisions needed by government if these technologies are to support the UK meet its climate obligations. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the Commission's position is on establishing this new sector in the UK. First of all, what's the case for negative emission technologies? Why do we need them? I think Paul's already made some very valid points there where we definitely agree with. So as this chart shows, it's difficult to see how we will be able to achieve net zero by 2050 without engineered removals. These need to work alongside other solutions. So we're in a position today where emissions stand at around 500 megatons. As presented in the light blue bar, 80 to 90% of emissions reductions are going to come from what we might be termed traditional methods, so cutting fossil fuel use as a source of energy, or at least capturing the carbon when fossil fuels are combusted, and also reducing activity that creates emissions in the first place, like reducing meat in our diets. But there are sectors where the solutions to remove greenhouse gas emissions completely do not yet exist. Negative emission technologies, alongside nature-based removals, can fill the current void in a solution for getting to net zero, or even push the UK further in delivering a net negative economy. We propose a reasonable estimate of 40 to 100 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent to be removed by 2050 to meet net zero. These are represented by the red and grey bars in the chart in front of you. And it's important to say, that the range is quite big, and there is obviously uncertainty about the exact size of the market in the future. But this uncertainty shouldn't diminish the need for near-term action to deploy these technologies. So what are we saying is actually needed? What does our report conclude? So our call to government is to get ahead of the game and secure the UK's place in the vanguard of countries deploying negative emissions technologies, so that by the 2030s, we have the capacity to help ensure we can meet our climate change obligations. This isn't tomorrow's problem. The government's own modelling states that the important role that greenhouse gas removal technologies will play in delivering the 6 carbon budget over the 2030s. But as yet, there's no concrete plan of action to deliver this. Our report calls on that plan and for government to move forward and have these plans in place by next year. We want to see a range of different engineered removals at megaton scale in the UK no later than 2030. This isn't a small challenge. These technologies, as many of you will know, are not rocket science. The basic chemistry is well understood, but no one is doing this at scale in the UK, and there is not an abundance of examples internationally either. But we're calling on a sector to scale of 5 to 10 megatons by 2030, and as I say, expecting that would grow to meet the net zero or support the UK meet its net zero targets in 2050. I must be clear that we don't want development of these technologies to come at the expense of continued action to reduce or prevent emissions in the first place. Engineered removals are far from an easy way out. They are resource intensive and come at a high cost. So reducing or preventing emissions will be the cheaper and easier option for many sectors. Equally important is making sure that these technologies deliver truly negative emissions, and Paul touched on that in his introduction. There are legitimate concerns around biomass sustainability and questions around the whole supply chain and life cycle emissions of these processes. So we have called on government to establish an independent monitoring regime that can verify that removals are genuine and account for the full life cycle emissions of the supply chain, regardless of whether those emissions occurred inside or outside the UK. This will help deliver public and investor confidence in this new infrastructure sector, which we think is vital, as if you don't have public and private sector confidence, you don't have political confidence. A plan from government is, of course, not enough on its own. It's critical that the plan establishes policies that address the market failures presenting the sector getting off the ground. At the heart of these market failures is the fact that there's just not enough demand for negative emissions from industry. Polluting industries have limited incentives currently to offset their emissions. Voluntary commitments from organisations to get their own emissions to zero is great, but not all sectors will do this without a push. The obvious way to create demand is to obligate those that emit carbon to pay to address it. This is really no different to how we deal with solid waste in this country. Companies pay for its removal and therefore take action to minimise waste where it is more efficient to do so. Greenhouse gas emissions and negative emissions technologies can deal with this and should therefore be viewed as simply an extension of our current approach to managing waste. So in our report, we recommend that government place obligations on greenhouse gas emitters to do something about the emissions they create. This will create demand for the services negative emission providers are ready and willing to deliver. To meet net zero commitments, the obligation to address emissions will need to be economy-wide and gradually increase to address 100% of residual emissions no later than 2050. One way to do this is to clearly use the current UK emissions trading scheme. That would require an extension of its current remit and the sectors that it covers. Initially, the price of emissions in the scheme are likely to be far too low to incentivise the deployment of negative emissions technologies. We suggest a reasonable cost range of between £100 and £400 per tonne for removals, and it's likely that, especially for first of a kind deployment, costs will be closer to the top of that range. This far exceeds the current price of carbon in the emissions trading scheme. So to provide demand and price certainty needed to get this nascent sector off the ground, we've called on government to offer further support in the near term that goes beyond creating the market needed for the long term. The key policy levers we have proposed are, or the one key policy lever we are proposing is a contract for revenue. This would offer a guaranteed price for each unit of carbon dioxide removed and could be linked to the price achieved in a market like the emissions trading scheme or through voluntary markets. Again, this is really no different to models that the UK has used before. The contract for difference mechanism used in the renewable sector is a good example of using a government mechanism to get technologies up and running and to reduce their costs. Since those first contracts for renewables were offered in 2014, we've seen the industry take off and costs come down substantially since. Of course, negative emission technologies do have some different characteristics to renewables. They're much more input intensive for one, so they rely on sort of external cost factors and energy prices, for example, but there is still strong reason to think that this type of support will bring down the cost of negative emissions technologies too. I started by saying that there's two broad technologies in the scope of the work we did: direct air capture and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Between and within these two categories, there are a range of approaches at different stages of maturity. The Commission is a strong advocate for not picking a winner and running with it. And for this reason, we have called out the need to develop a portfolio of first-of-a-kind projects in the near term. Not all projects are at a stage where they are ready to sign contracts and get building. So we're looking to government to supplement its existing innovation funding and support lesser developed technologies. We want to see these technologies pull through from demonstration stage to being in a position where they could sign contracts. And finally, of course, we're an infrastructure commission, so we need to look beyond other sectors too. And obviously, these negative emission technologies will rely on a number of other infrastructure sectors. Access to enabling infrastructure, including carbon transport and storage, power, heat, biomass supply chains, and water, must not become a blocker to the deployment of negative emissions technologies. Particularly important is ensuring that carbon transport and storage networks are developed at the scale needed to manage demand, not only from negative emissions, but also all the other sectors shown in the numbers in the chart, which I've stolen from the Climate Change Committee. The current government progress on enabling delivery of carbon transport and storage is very welcome, but to meet the level of demand demonstrated in this chart and demonstrated by others will require going beyond current ambition. I haven't yet talked about how all this affects the end consumer. Getting to net zero must be taken as a given, and this will require negative emissions technologies. This places an additional cost on consumers, and there's no way of getting around that. But acting decisively, acting now, and getting on with it is, in the Commission's view, the best way to manage the impact on consumers' pockets. As part of our work, we analysed the distribution of costs across different types of consumers. Higher spending households have and will continue to have higher carbon footprints and will therefore pay more as a contribution to the cost of dealing with our carbon. Based on some assumptions, we estimate that the average household cost in 2050 will be around £200 a year. Of course, there may be some groups for whom this is a bigger concern, and we are clear in our report that government needs to undertake detailed analysis of the impacts, as well as considering how it wants to shape this new regulated market to direct costs at certain points in the supply chain. And with that, I shall stop sharing my slides, hopefully, and hopefully that's been a helpful canter through the Commission's position on negative emissions. Just give a little plug to please download our report on the website, and if you'd like to know more, please do get in touch. And then I shall pass back to you, Paul.
Lovely, thank you, Joanna. And I mean, great on a couple of fronts. The first, the range of reductions needed. I mean, clearly negative emissions can sort of fill in for where other sectors failed to deliver. So a big range there. But I think in particular helpful was the fact that you've given shorter term targets for 2030 and 2035, which basically at the moment exceed government's ambitions, I think, for negative emissions. So that's extremely helpful as a sort of catalyst for the sector. And I think finally your thing on fuel poverty is a point well made to remember that I think all of us are probably strong advocates for carbon tax and doing everything that we're doing, but sure as hell, as part of policy, we've really got to see how carbon pricing differentially impacts across the economy and have measures in place that address fuel poverty in particular. So I think all of those points well made. So thanks for that. So I'm going to switch over to Baz now, and as I say, from Boston Consulting Group, but very much from a buyer's perspective. You know, what are you looking for, the markets, etc. So Baz, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Paul. And sort of, I think one thing that Joe touched upon was sort of the role of markets and when markets play a role. And I think one of the things that sort of I'll elaborate a bit further on is like how we see that sort of developing from a buyer's perspective. And by means of introduction, so BCG is a global consulting firm with close to 30,000 people. Our global emissions are about 500 kilotons, of which the majority of that is business travel. And I think Joe rightfully pointed out, right, sort of we follow very much the philosophy of like sort of avoid, reduce, remove in terms of like how we approach our own emissions. And of course, avoid and reduce is the first step in terms of deployment of sort of reduction in our travel habits, but that also combined with the use of sustainable aviation fuel to prevent CO2 from getting into the atmosphere in the first place. And I think in sort of our target setting, that's about the first 50% per FTE of the ambition. The remaining 50% for us is really sort of on the remove agenda. And as a consulting firm, but as any company who sets itself targets in terms of remove, you then get into the very interesting discussion about, okay, how do you go about setting yourself sort of removal targets and how do you go about it? And what we very much see is like we carry responsibility to set early price signals for the market in terms of like what type of removals would we want to buy. And there's very much a recognition that sort of that cannot be only nature-based solutions, that has to come from engineered and permanent offsets. But we also realize sort of that sort of in the immediate term, sort of those engineered solutions are extremely expensive. But we realize sort of that in order to create the demand signals, we have to sort of be in the market for those very expensive early stage offsets. And I think there's definitely a market where sort of I think a combination of the private sector, potentially also with government funding that sort of Joe was alluding to, can trigger that early stage demand. I don't think it necessarily from our perspective has to be one or the other. And sort of what we've done, at least in BCG perspective, is set ourselves sort of a publicly stated offset cost of $35 a ton by 2025 for a portfolio of nature-based solutions combined with sort of engineered solutions, going up to $80 a ton by 2030. Now, of course, within that sort of sits the portfolio effect of like very expensive engineered solutions with, let's say, nature-based solutions of high quality and high standards that you would get at $5 a ton. But we realize that sort of the early stage engineered solution projects really will come at hundreds of dollars per ton. And we understand that that sort of is something that the technology needs to go through. And I think from a buyer's and a customer's perspective, you get into a number of different things that I think are quite important. I think the first one, and that was already touched upon, is like the importance of standards and what you sign yourself up to, and not having to invent the wheel yourself. And sort of coalitions such as the Science-Based Target Initiative, but also specific sort of validation sort of bodies like the gold standard, I think have a very important role to play, sort of to ensure that not every individual private company has to sort of define the wheel, and can also be assured that sort of what they're buying themselves into is of the right quality and doesn't relate to greenwashing. And I think there has to be also recognition that sort of a company like ourselves can put a lot of resources against sort of looking into different types of offsets, sort of using brokerage firms, etc. We realize not every company has that ability or resourcing. So I think that ability for independent bodies to set standards will be particularly important for, let's say, smaller and medium enterprises who don't have the same level of resources, let's say, as a professional service firm. I think the second thing that we really see is developer risk. Sort of what we are getting into with a number of parties that we sign MOUs with is like sort of what is your firm commitment to get to volume? Who have you signed up to? What happens if your plant is delayed? Because we've made ourselves commitments in terms of what we will buy from an offset perspective and what we want to hit. And sort of that risk sharing with individual developers of projects is something that we see as increasingly critical. I think closely related to that is like, once the CO2 is captured through what means or another, sort of, and particularly with sequestration and underground storage, who actually carries the liability? Sort of, where does your responsibility as a company who bought offsets ends? And sort of, who carries that long-term liability for CO2 storage? We see this both in direct air capture as well as in CCS projects as a major sort of hurdle on both sides of the Atlantic, and anywhere that CCS and sort of DACS and other sort of technologies are being deployed. And I think the last thing, and I think you will see this with many private enterprises, is cost still matters. Cost is a component. And I think energy costs are different in Europe than they are in the US, and they play a role in terms of sort of scaling up some of these engineered solutions. So I think being cost competitive ultimately within any nation will matter in terms of scaling up your sort of negative emissions technologies. I think the last thing that we see as quite important is beyond sort of reduce and remove, is to then actually what we call engage. And I think as many companies in this ecosystem sharing the responsibility to build coalitions and engage, share information, we see a lot of different levels of maturity of thinking, and sort of there's a lot of mistrust around sort of negative emissions technology. There's a lot of sort of biases towards it, and sort of having sort of mature conversations, building first mover coalitions, whether that's through the World Economic Forum or whether that's within specific UK bodies, we see as critical to not do this as a company on your own, but to really do this together. I think I've used up most of my time, but hopefully that gives a little bit of a sense of where we come from a buyer's perspective.
Thanks, Baz, and some strong messages there of actually the common interest of the public and private sectors working together for these projects, and having much more of a shared view of the common standards. That if you're paying for a negative emission, you know what you're getting. It's there, it's permanent, it's in the ground. We know what's happened, and that's not a public versus private. That's the sectors have to get that right together to give confidence and integrity to this market. So thanks for that good message. So let's now turn to two views from the technology side. So I'll turn to Amy first to give us the views on what we need to encourage the DACS market, the direct air capture market. Amy, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I thought it was just helpful maybe to recap a few bullets in my head from what I've heard about other speakers before I go into what that means for direct air capture. So I think in terms of context, we've heard about the need for negative emissions. Joe's spoken about the 40 to 100 megatons in the UK by 2050 that will be needed, and actually 5 to 30 that is needed by 2030. Coming from an aviation background, I stay very close to the sector. Whenever you look at aviation decarbonisation roadmaps, a large portion is from removals. It's clear that we'll need a portfolio of solutions. I think we've heard no silver bullet, can't bet on any one technology, and I think that's absolutely right. Two of the most developed solutions to be deployed at scale are direct air capture and sequestration and BECCS, both of which are going to require CCS infrastructure. So very fitting that we're on this CCUS Plus conference. I think it is important to emphasize that these negative emissions decarbonize all sectors, not just industry. And then I think one thing we maybe haven't touched on yet is their importance in the green transition. So the Coalition of Negative Emissions did a recent report with McKinsey where we looked at the overlap of skill sets between traditional oil and gas sectors and negative emissions technologies. And we found that there's about a 70 to 90% overlap in those skill sets. So another important reason why negative emissions technologies. But then maybe just a little bit on direct air capture, which is what carbon engineering does. We have been developing a direct air capture solution for just over a decade now, with our company based in British Columbia in Canada. When we capture that CO2 directly from the atmosphere, we can either sequester and create that negative emission, or it can be used in drop-in compatible products like aviation fuels, but maybe a sentence on that at the end. So right now we are busy engineering at megaton scale. We're working with our partners in the US, 1.5, on the world's first megaton scale direct air capture facility that will be capable of capturing 1 million tons of CO2 from the atmosphere each year. We are in the detailed engineering phase of that, and the plant should be online by 2024. So I think very clear, it's coming now. So why in the US? We've touched on the importance of regulated markets. Right now, we are able to create that revenue stack through policy out in the US. Direct air capture and sequestration can generate a credit in the Californian low carbon fuel standard, where they've effectively recognized that removing carbon in the value chain before it's combusted, it is equivalent from a climate perspective to removing it afterwards. So 1 + -1 = 0. You can generate that credit. On top of that, the 45Q tax credit rewards companies who are permanently storing CO2. And carbon removal is certified under both of those mechanisms through standards, and the liabilities are defined. So we're also engineering a plant with our partners Storegga up in northeast Scotland, leveraging the Acorn infrastructure. And I think what's really clear for the UK and actually any market that's following when they're looking at those revenue stacks are probably 5 dimensions. The first is the need for open access to transport and storage and clean power. The second is identifying that financeable revenue stream for early plants. You deploy to lower costs. Where the costs are higher for first plant, what is that? Could it be, for example, a contract for difference mechanism? And then access to strong carbon pricing markets in the mid to long term. And you've mentioned the ETS, could be the ETS in the UK as well. What are those policies focused on transportation? Transportation being a hard to abate sector. We're talking about a sustainable aviation fuel mandate. Can we think about an equivalent for removals, which are also part of that roadmap? And then really the fifth thing there is, again, underpinning by that robust carbon removal certification that enables access to the policies. I think it's really important to recognise that direct air capture and sequestration and BECCS projects are happening now, which means that business models need to be accelerated for tangible projects whilst we bring through the next stage of innovation. For projects that are already there and ready to go, we really need to be seeing them as part of cluster sequencing decisions. So that's a little bit on the regulatory side. I think, as Bad's touched on, the voluntary market, we see it as incredibly important to really demand signal and show early interest in plants, get those early plants going, help break the chicken and egg situation. you have plant developers who have infrastructure funders who want to build a plant, but you need demand in order to do so. You have companies that want access to high integrity negative emissions, which can't be there until plants are built. So that's your chicken and egg situation. And voluntary removals helped break that a little bit, and Carbon Engineering launched a carbon removal service with that in mind this year. So just finally, I'd say we haven't really talked about CCU, the usage of the carbon dioxide in this forum, but we are working on that too. We are recipients of a grant from the DFT in the UK, working with LanzaTech, taking direct air capture all the way through alcohol to jet to create sustainable aviation fuels. I think the key to get these sustainable aviation fuels sourcing CO2 from the atmosphere going is the differentiation of different sources of CO2. Are they truly close to carbon neutral because they're coming from the atmosphere, or are we actually using fossil fuel sources of CO2, which is resulting in more accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere? So I think that's me. I will pass back to Paul and then hear a bit from Carl, I think, on BECCS.
Thanks, Amy. And clearly, your speech is able to make a lot of people here jealous, in as much as you can actually talk about a project where most of us have been talking about a future project for a very long time. So thank you for that. And I think that this notion of using the voluntary market to help break through that circle and get funding, if they understand the permanence of what's being proposed, and some things we would maybe come back to there, which was interesting around this sort of different sources of CO2 for different purposes, so if you're trying to offset airplane, can you get that money into DACS, or the creation of direct fuel for it, from sector to sector may have a better way of getting the right price for the right solution. So let's come back to that theme. Last but obviously not least, Carl, give us a BECCS perspective on it all, and what you guys need now to make it all work.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. What I'll do is I'll say a little bit about what we're doing at Drax, and then I think what I want to do is talk a little bit also about the topic of acceptability, which I think is key to maximizing the potential of the industry. So start off by doing a little bit about what we're doing at Drax. So many people will be familiar with Drax as a large UK utility, best known for our power station up in Yorkshire, originally the largest coal-fired power station in Western Europe. Over the last 10 years, we've been gradually converting it to use sustainable biomass. So we're now generating 4 out of 6 units are generating renewable electricity. We're the single largest source of renewable electricity in the UK. And we're still supporting the UK grid by contributing about 6% of the UK's electricity. So we're still a strategically significant side, but have managed to make that transition from fossil fuel to a renewable fuel. And the next step for us on that journey is using CCS on our biomass units, which would then enable us to be carbon negative. So our ambition is to convert the first of those 4 biomass units to CCS by 2027, and have a second unit up and running on CCS by 2030. And in doing that, there's 4 key benefits as we see it. So number 1 is around keeping the UK on track to hit its carbon budgets. So those 2 BECCS units I mentioned would generate around 8 million tons of negative emissions. That's roughly half of what the UK government's own analysis shows is needed to hit its 6 carbon budget by 2035. So that's making a significant contribution to the UK's decarbonisation. The second point is around the levelling up agenda. So our analysis shows that our project will support about 10,000 jobs through construction to operation. Again, that's very important given our location in the north of England. The third point is about cost-effective decarbonisation. So having done some recent work with Baringa, a well-known energy consultancy, we think that by doing BECCS at Drax, we would save the UK about £13 billion in hitting its 6 carbon budget, and about 26 billion, so double that, in achieving net zero. And that's because by doing BECCS at Drax, you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere in a way which is more cost effective than some of the more expensive policy interventions that we'll have to consider as we travel to net zero. And then the final point is about international leadership. And I know Jo mentioned this earlier. She used the phrase the UK being at the vanguard of countries. And we'd fully agree with that. We can see how this is obviously not a UK issue. Climate change is not a UK issue, but it's well positioned to be a leader in BECCS and DACS technologies. And by doing early projects in the UK, we can then take those technologies and learnings abroad. So all of those things that we think are very compelling reasons to do a BECCS project in the 2020s. I think Amy's mapped out some of the sort of commercial considerations. We, like everyone else, feel that some sort of support package is needed for our first unit. That would then enable us to make an investment decision in the project. We're well placed insofar as we generate two products. We generate clean electricity, but we also generate negative carbon at Drax. So thinking creatively, we think we can find a value for money support mechanism that adequately rewards both those byproducts linked to what you could realistically expect to pay for them in the marketplace, both now, but as we approach 2030 and beyond, and do that in a way which is cost effective for taxpayers, consumers, and other key stakeholders. So I think as we sit on the precipice of the CCUS announcement around priority clusters and where the business models are going, we obviously look forward to seeing in the next few weeks some further announcements from the government on a BECCS business model and how they're intending to take that forward. So that's a little bit about what we're doing at Drax. As I say, I wanted to kind of complement what we've been hearing from Joe, Baz, and Amy by just talking about acceptability very quickly, because I think that's at the heart of this topic. Obviously, negative emissions is an emerging industry, and I think getting the buy-in of multiple stakeholders, policymakers, investors, NGOs, communities, is obviously critical to maximizing the potential of the industry in the UK. So what I want to do is just highlight 3 interventions I think could help us get that public acceptability piece better ingrained in what we're doing. So the first is around setting standards. So obviously setting clear and common standards that sets out what a high quality negative emission is going to be critical, both addressing concerns from environmental groups, but also for corporate purchasers or investors to know that when they buy a ton of negative emissions, they're buying a high caliber ton of negative emissions. So we need to move quickly on that. The good news is there's a lot of good work being done by multiple initiatives on that. One we're involved in is the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, led by Mark Carney, is looking at setting high quality standards for carbon removals. We think that's important and should complement the work that will be done on the compliance side of things in the coming years through UK government efforts and otherwise. So that's setting standards. Another one is about monitoring and reporting. So again, scaling up the industry, we need clear accounting frameworks that demonstrate and capture the value of removing carbon from the atmosphere and does that in a transparent way. And it can then feed into the corporate reporting that is being used by FTSE 100s to demonstrate they're achieving their net zero strategies. Again, the good news is there's multiple efforts on that front. One that we're involved in, again, with carbon engineering and others, is the CCS Plus initiative, which is a new initiative launched by industry to set out those clear carbon accounting frameworks. And then finally, I think there's a really key point about vision setting. So the UK is particularly well placed to be an early mover on negative emissions because it has such rich geological resources that could be used for CCS in all shapes and sizes, but for BECCS and DACS specifically. And we've seen in the past that setting targets from a government perspective can be really powerful. We've seen in offshore wind and others in terms of accelerating progress in certain industries and seeing certain technologies move forward. So I think there's a real opportunity thinking about the upcoming net zero strategy that we expect to be published very, very soon, but also COP26 next month. There's a real opportunity for the UK government, I think, to set out what that long-term vision is for negative emissions in the UK. And I think that in turn will enable us to maximize the potential of the sector in the UK, but then also export, again, the learnings and technologies and skills that we've accumulated in doing those early projects and export them abroad and help the UK become a kind of clean leader in negative emissions technologies. So there's some very quick reflections, Paul. I'll hand over to you, but obviously very keen to pick up any questions in Q&A.
Great, thank you for that, Carl. The questions are becoming thick and fast, so I will try and pare them down to some key themes, I think, if I can. We got a good bit of time to talk through. I'll start with a sort of timetable question, going back mainly probably to you, Joe. Some related questions. One sort of people have been asking, how long before you think government support will prove unnecessary and the market can do it by itself? And I suppose a related question, what type of legislation and regulation did you envisage is necessary to get this all implemented?
Thanks, Paul. I think I'll take your two-part question in the other way around. So, I mean, our report sets out a timeline of action needed by government. So that starts next year, really, with a plan and, you know, a commitment to develop this sector in the UK. And, you know, it has to be next year, really, because if you look back at what's needed by 2050 and bring that back to what's needed by 2030 and in the 2030s for to meet carbon budgets, you know, you can't delay starting to get these projects off the ground and building. We called for 5 to 10 megatons to be established by 2030. So we'd expect the building of these and the operation of these to start before we get to 2030, clearly. You know, 5 to 10 megatons isn't just one project, it's multiple projects. And, you know, in terms of like the legislation needed, well, clearly you need the business models established to ensure that, to sort of set up the guidelines and the rules around the contracts for contracts for revenue. And also there's a couple of things that we think are vitally important before you get the market up and running. Those being, as I think, you know, Carl and others have said, is making sure we've got the standards in place ahead of the market moving and ahead of these projects actually delivering negative emissions. So we've called for a sort of independent regulatory regime to be established by 2024. Also, going back to my final point, you know, this will place a cost on consumers, and we think it's really important that the government understands where those costs are going to land ahead of first projects being built. Again, it adds to the points Carl was talking about around acceptability. So lots of action from government in the near term, in the next 5 years, so that you know, project developers can start moving in the near term as well, but get us to 5 to 10 megatons by 2030.
Can I just, oh, sorry, have you got?
No, carry on, please.
Well, I was going to just ask a question which related to that, but for you and Carl together, because, you know, Carl clearly went through all the standards, the measurements, the task force and monitoring. And you said you've called for an independent government monitorer of negative emissions. One key question is, does that actually need to be public sector? And I'm saying this cynically because of the speed of what's necessary, and that maybe speed is not their greatest quality. But if you think in other sectors, you know, from accounting standards to green bonds, the private sector recognized a need, did collaborate and created quite agreed standards, you know, some of which have lasted hundreds of years, to try and make that, you know, happen. Does it need to be public sector, or could actually this be driven by the private sector? And obviously with the task force that Carl discussed and the coalition that we're working on, could these bodies come together and initiate that in the private sector?
I think it definitely requires private sector collaboration, you know, bringing the knowledge base of private sector into the mix. And we've said that in our reports. I think from you know, how the body is owned, I think independence is important. So I don't think it should sit with any of the individual private developers, but yeah, you know, potentially it could be a sort of separate company that is funded by providers. But as long as it's got the right governance and the rules, that could work. But I think it does require government and industry, both those that are going to be buying and those that are going to be selling negative emissions, to come together to develop those. And, you know, some standards for parts of the value chain of negative emissions already exist. So it's just a lot of it's bringing things together. And
yeah.
Carl.
Yeah. Carl, you agree with, should we take more of the initiative?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting analog to what happened in the biomass industry, nascent biomass industry 10 or so years ago. So a group of industry leaders came together to set up the Sustainable Biomass Program. So a bit like what Joe has described. So industry funded, but arm's length with a separate secretariat, governance body, etc. And that effectively set out a certification scheme whereby if you are a biomass user anywhere in Europe or indeed the world, there are common standards that you can adhere to. And as long as you're adhering to those standards, you can demonstrate to the UK government, to the European Commission, whoever the relevant sort of national body is, that you are doing the right thing and adhering to high standards. And I don't think there's anything that prevents the industry from following a similar route. I think your point, urgency, is the key one. I think we don't have a lot of time to embed some of this. Clearly, there is a risk of fragmentation. The longer we drift, the longer that there are multiple initiatives, which are helpful to a point, but actually a little bit of harmonization can go a long way as well. So I think some sort of opportunity for and we can start maybe in the UK, UK sort of developers, standard setters coming together with the UK government to establish a kind of UK framework. That feels like a very sensible starting point for me, and then we can build from there over time as we learn more about the technologies as we deploy.
Yeah, and I suppose the UK has an advantage of things like the major accounting firms and key CCS industry players, which then can roll out. Maybe Baz, it might be worth your perspective, from a consumption side, but what's the importance you see of standards, of permanence in the decision that buyers of negative emissions will make?
Yeah, I mean, I touched upon it already a little bit, sort of in how we look at purchases. And I think the voluntary market and the mandatory market will, I think, continue to coexist. And sort of, I think the voluntary side will continue to also develop. I would almost argue that in part the voluntary market is there because of a level of impatience with a certain level of private sector players that want to move faster than government can keep up. Where we do, and this comes to Amy's point of, for example, what you see in the US of effectively developers value stacking different regulatory regimes and on top of that voluntary regimes to get to a final investment decision on a plant. I think we are likely to see that elsewhere as well in Europe, given the high level of cost that is needed for these first facilities. What I think might potentially be unhelpful is we see a real divergence in terms of the types of standards that are being set, because you get into very complicated discussions about sort of additionality and sort of whose credits are they, how are they being validated. And I think that I see as a risk of the worst of both worlds, which is like a divergence of mandatory and voluntary markets around standards. And if I see, for example, the amount of debate in the European Union around, for example, taxonomy, right, around investment, I think that's a real risk that we face around sort of direct air capture and negative emissions technologies potentially.
It does strike me that this is an industry where the best will be the enemy of the good, trying to get the perfect definition, when in some cases, if we see an elephant, we know it's an elephant, and there are some that are so palpably putting things into the ground that maybe we should, be pretty clear that that's what's going on. So doing that in a sort of practical way, which encourages early projects, is probably definitely a way forward, rather than waiting for the perfect definition that may never arrive in 10 years' time. On that, Amy, some questions just on the DACS model in the UK context, because you gave the US example, but that was based on low fuel prices in the US and tax regimes, etc. We don't replicate. So the question we received is, what do you think the business model will be that ultimately will support the Storego project that you're working on? What do you think that will look like?
Yeah, I'll comment on DACS in the UK in particular, as opposed to, I think, an individual project. But there are multiple avenues to look at. I think one that we've discussed as a group is the ETS, which is an existing carbon pricing mechanism. So one way to look at it is, how do you include removals within that? Now, currently, because the ETS is focused on more kind of industry and power, it will be trading in, let's say, the £50 to £100 region for the foreseeable future, for quite some time. So if we're to look at that as a mechanism, then it might be including a contract for difference. And I just want to be very clear about the philosophy that the ETS is looking at the industry and power sectors, whereas we've talked about maybe what negative emissions do is really help those hard to abate sectors. Hard to abate sectors being maybe transportation, agriculture, buildings, etc. So the way that we've looked at it in the US is what are the policies that those sectors need to target. So if I take transportation in the UK, for example, there's the road transport fuel obligation, the RTFO. We're talking about creating a separate sustainable aviation fuel mandate. If it's that transportation sector looking to decarbonize in part through removals, then maybe it's those targeted policies, the kind of the transportation policies we need to look at, as well as the ETS that is perhaps more focused traditionally on different sectors. So I think that's probably different ways to look at it. The answer isn't clear, so I think the third part of my answer will be whatever mechanism we use to support it. I think the UK clearly understands we do need negative emissions. We now need to move. So thinking about the business models needs to happen quickly. When we think about GGR business models in general, the answer might be different depending on what technology, what stage of readiness you're looking at. But it's clear for the ones that are ready to deploy, we should be looking for that mechanism very quickly so that you can build out negative emissions technologies at the same time that you're building out CCS infrastructure through clusters.
And actually, Amy clarified something which I found very helpful the other day, which was in my head, if we allow negative emissions as an offset to the ETS regime, that's fantastic because that's immediately a vast source of funding, and that will be a very useful source of funding. However, it's a particular funding at a particular price, which may not equal the marginal price in the sectors looking to offset. So it may not be at a price which would be useful for particular DACS projects or for SAF projects, where maybe the marginal cost being avoided in the sector, like in flying, is a more relevant reference point. So this is a more complex market. We've got to make sure the incentives and the avoided cost are right in the right sector as a way of thinking about it. I've got a question from Patrick, but probably aimed at all of you around permanence. And I think actually there's two aspects to Patrick's question. I'm going to say his version and my version, because what he was saying is nature-based solutions are rarely permanent. Could you please comment on how the focus on permanent removals can be enhanced? So obviously the underpinning there is that we need to stress permanence in technological solutions. I think there is the other side of the story, which with my coalition I've got to also worry about, which is, but how do we also make sure that we can get nature-based solutions, and who should be paying for those and how should they be financed? So we've got to find maybe different answers for different sectors, but maybe firstly put to you guys, what should we be doing about permanence and should we stress that more? Let's ask that question first, but any observations on what you would recommend to help nature-based solutions also useful? Shall I start with randomly Joe? I'll ask that question.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, our report is very much focused on the technological side of removals, but yeah, permanence is obviously very important, and we made clear that these things really do need to be permanent. That's why you need standards, and as Carl said, that's why you need monitoring and reporting. So we need a monitoring and reporting regime, I think, that takes account of the fact that if you're using sequestration versus using kind of afforestation, that those have different levels of permanence, and it's probably quite a bit harder on nature-based solutions to sort of prove that the carbon is kind of sequestered in the plant rather than being sequestered in a sort of the North Sea oil fields. But I think there must be a way of ensuring that the monitoring and reporting takes account of the different levels of permanence you might get from the different solutions.
Baz, how important for investors then?
I think very important. And ultimately our view is like, it needs to be 100% permanent over time. We realize that we can't get there immediately, but something that originates from fossil fuel, i.e. hundreds of millions years old, has to go back to fundamentally where it came from, or it needs to be permanent. The other thing I would though say is, I think that the discussion around nature-based solutions is starting to shift within the corporate world, at least we observe, from just being about carbon removals to what we call nature positive, and the broader role that forests actually play in sort of our natural world, right? We've become part of the Leaf Coalition and a number of other coalitions around sort of the protection of forests. So I feel like it's almost like and, but I think forests will play a broader role than just being a source of carbon sequestration. I mean, they support the natural world.
Because of the biodiversity and sustainability, yeah. And that took me to the thought processes, which is maybe if we're thinking of this as somewhere to spend negative emissions, it may be as a percentage of the total to reflect the less convincing answer on permanence, or not doing it at all, or maybe only a proportion of investors or a type of investor. And Amy, I don't know if you want to comment on that, because I know you've got some views there of what might be appropriate.
Yeah, probably I echo what's being said. Just to throw one other thought into the mix, that when you're thinking about a scheme like the ETS, for emissions itself, it has extremely strong monitoring, reporting and verification, MRV standards. We could think about that being equivalent in removals. So maybe only allowing technological permanent removals within something like an ETS scheme, and maybe thinking about sectoral roadmaps and the LULUCF sector, or the land use change and forestry sector, being self-containing. So emissions coming from that sector are also removed by that sector. So elements like nature-based solutions. I also think when we talk about nature-based solutions, we have to be very clear about the word nature. I think where you've got afforestation, you're encouraging biodiversity, you're growing what would naturally have been there. Fantastic. Sometimes you're seeing highly engineered solutions to climate change, and they don't necessarily fall into that same camp, and can actually discourage biodiversity by going through removals.
And if I just very last question, because conscious of time, Carl, just turning that whole question on its head, which is, nature-based solutions is now becoming wider. It's not just CO2, but it's biodiversity and things like flood protection and rising water levels. Clearly, you're going to be very worried about the biodiversity impact of growing large amounts of feedstock for Drax. How have you sort of made yourself comfortable? What's the type of monitoring and reporting you do to show the positive impacts? Yeah,
so we obviously have UK standards driven through Ofgem that we need to meet. So we're constantly presenting monthly reports to Ofgem that evidences how we're sourcing our biomass, where that biomass comes from, the GHG footprint from the forest right through to the power station. So that's all pretty well embedded in UK regulation already. What we've done separately is also publish what we call catchment area analysis. So wherever we have a pellet mill, or wherever we source from a pellet mill in the southern US, for example, we will establish a baseline as to what the sort of forest carbon outlook looks like at a landscape level. And then we'll look across multiple years and see how that changes. And I think this goes to the key point about additionality, Paul. Yeah. We can evidence and demonstrate that commercial demand for wood products, primarily in our case bioenergy, results in increased forest stock and increased carbon inventory in those forests, and has a positive correlation between the two. Therefore, there's been a clear impact, right, and a clear benefit. And I think this is the way the complementary nature of BECCS for nature-based solutions comes in. We create a commercial incentive both on the nature-based side, but also from the supplier of biomass side, to be more active in their forest management, which creates, bigger, better forests, which store more carbon than they would otherwise. And I think that's a key point. And I think, going back to the sequestration versus nature-based, I think all this is an education piece, right? For investors, with policymakers, this is uncharted ground. We don't have a lot of projects that we can point to on the ground today. So I think we just need to constantly educate, inform, don't presuppose knowledge about any one topic. And then I think hopefully we'll get to the right place, plus or minus.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carl. I should wrap up now, conscious of time. So thank you everyone for a great session. Hopefully a good diverse session of views for those logging in today. I'll finish with an advert for tomorrow, because we've got the quasi-quartan ministerial discussion in the morning. You'll hear a lot more from the clusters, how that's going, and a personal favorite from mine on dispersed sites, because energy from waste, I think, could be a key source of negative emissions. So some great sessions tomorrow. But just to say thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you.